Welcome back, Sega fans, to the next instalment of Street Fighter on Sega. This is Dan, the Mega Driver of the Sega guys, and after the Mega Drive ports of Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition and Super Street Fighter 2, we now go to the Sega Saturn for the next Street Fighter game, Street Fighter Alpha.
Dan, you're forgetting one.
Nope, Super Turbo didn't come to a Sega console until much later, so Street Fighter Alpha was next.
Dan, we're not talking about Street Fighter Alpha. You're forgetting the first Sega Saturn Street Fighter game.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The day you forgot about this game may have been your most embarrassing day on the channel. But for this game, it was Tuesday.
You mean... Oh god. Right, I guess in this episode of the Sega Guys, I'll be looking back on Street Fighter, the movie. It can't be that bad, can it? The story with this really just comes back to what an incredible cultural juggernaut Street Fighter 2 had become. In my Special Champion Edition video, I talked about how Street Fighter 2 was a multimedia phenomenon with near endless tie-in media and merchandise. Of course, with a franchise this popular, a film was inevitable, and so it moved into production with a 1994 release date targeted. This isn't a movie retrospective, so I'll be brief. The film, despite requiring Capcom's say on every decision, was a bit of a mess. Strange casting decisions, cheesy dialogue and action sequences, a very loose interpretation of the game's setting and plot, none of which was helped by Jean-Claude Van Damme in the lead role, inhaling thousands of dollars worth of Columbia's finest every week. However, the film wasn't a total disaster. Though cheesy, some of the scenes are very memorable, and it's all quite entertaining, while it also managed to be a box office success to a degree, and it continues to make money for Capcom today. The greatest thing to come out of the Street Fighter movie was Raul Julia's legendary performance as Bison, a performance he delivered whilst terminally ill. Julia's kids, like many of us, were enormous fans of Street Fighter 2, and so, despite his ill health, Raul Julia not only took the role, but gave it everything he had as a gift to his children and to fans of the game around the world. And it's through this that he delivered something truly special. Despite everything else around him, he steals every scene that he's in, making the movie worth watching for his performance alone. So, a film of that magnitude needs tie-in media. You can see it with the recent Minecraft movie. There has to be tie-in media and merchandise, like the toy from the restaurant, based on the film, based on the game. And thus, Street Fighter needed a game to tie in with the film that was based on the game. Now, timelines aren't clear, but while the movie was being produced, Capcom met with a company called Incredible Technologies, a company better known for their Golden Tee Golf series, which, despite the fall of arcades, has been near ever present in bars and casinos for nearly 30 years now. At the time though, they had developed a couple of fighting games, such as Time Killers and Bloodstorm, both of which, despite being decidedly average fighters, demonstrated some interesting visual tricks for the time. Capcom approached them to make an entry to the Street Fighter series, which had been facing stiff competition from Mortal Kombat and its sequel with their digitised fighters. According to one member of the project, the game they were to develop using these digitised visuals was Street Fighter 3, at the time the most anticipated sequel of all time. However, probably because the movie shoots overlapped with the game's development, it seems the decision was made to create a tie-in and take the opportunity to digitally capture the movie stars on set for the game. Incredible Technologies' arcade game arrived in March 1995, 3 months after the film's release. The results? Well, take a look.
Ryu wins.
Incredible Technologies have admitted that they weren't set up to deliver on a game as important as Street Fighter, and Capcom were very much hands-off with the release until the 11th hour, when the Japanese team visited Incredible Technologies and apparently weren't impressed with what they saw. with Yoshiki Okamoto allegedly furious at how the game was turning out. Given the level of investment and lateness of the feedback, there wasn't time to make significant changes and the game released in this state. So what we have is a game with an identity crisis. Presentation wise, it tries to be both Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, but ends up kind of being neither. The gameplay comes off as goofy, with strange hit detection, bonkers air juggles, bizarre new special moves and effects, and crazy gameplay features like Slam Master. Unlike the movie, which was at least a modest success, the arcade game was a complete flop, partly because the movie was already a few months old at the time and something of a laughingstock, and partly because the game itself wasn't great, and finally because, well, just look at these other fighting games that came out at the end of 1994. Would you really play Street Fighter the movie in the arcade over any of these 6 games? No, I didn't think so. And so, with the arcade game complete and the next generation of consoles now on store shelves, it was time for a port, right? Actually, no. Announced in November 1994 was the console version of Street Fighter the movie, the game, for the Sega Saturn, 32X and Sony PlayStation. However, this game was not developed by Incredible Technologies. Instead, Capcom developed this game in-house. The pre-rendered fighters captured by Incredible Technologies were retained, but then altered, with fighters digitally corrected to closer reflect their Street Fighter II counterparts. Backgrounds too were completely remade, as was the audio, with none of the butchered anglicised move names, and instead we get re-recorded dialogue closer to Street Fighter II. For example, so what do we get when we boot the game up? Well, there's this intro featuring clips from the film, with this extremely dramatic theme. Straight away, this deviates from the arcade track mode, which advertises the various actors in the game and showcases the insane gameplay loops of this janky title. The Saturn version then is immediately more cinematic. If you're playing the Japanese release, that would be even more obvious with the Real Battle on Film title, and that leads into the game modes too. In addition to the standard arcade and versus modes, there's a movie battle mode as well as a trial mode. The movie battle mode is an interesting one. In it, you play as just one character, Captain Guile, and here you make your way through a very loose adaptation of the movie's plot. It opens up with a battle with M. Bison that you actually don't have to win. You then get a 50-minute time limit to make your way through the mode. While you only play as Guile, you are assisted by Cammy, who is essentially your narrator for your journey and offers you branching paths in the story where you'll need to make a choice. Ultimately though, all roads lead to a battle with M. Bison at the end. Trial mode gives you a single credit to get as far as you can, or complete it, and then it rates you on your progress, very similarly to Virtua Fighter's ranking mode. Arcade and versus modes are exactly as you'd expect. In those and trial mode you get to choose from 15 combatants, which is more or less the same as the arcade. Okay, so the arcade game has 14 fighters, though the Bison Troopers sporting different palettes sort of count as different characters. It depends, who cares? So compared to the arcade then, the Saturn version loses the Bison Troopers but gains DJ and Blanka as playable characters, more closely aligning to the cast of Super Street Fighter II, albeit still missing T-Hawk, Dhalsim and Fei Long, though the console retains Captain Sawada, the character from the movie, named after the actor in the role who Capcom envisioned to be their mascot of sorts. Anyway, he's the closest the game has to Fei Long, and even motion captured a number of Fei Long's moves, albeit in this game he still plays fundamentally differently. As you may have noticed already, this game is ugly. Look, we know that digitised games haven't aged all that gracefully, but even at the time, the muddy visuals and unnatural animation made this game horrid to look at, especially compared to the arcade game and also in comparison to games like Mortal Kombat 3, itself having a style and level of polish that made Midway's game still look like a class act. This means that first impressions are poor. As an early title on both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation in the West, the Sega 32X version unsurprisingly being cancelled, it suffered visually when compared to the Virtua Fighters, Tekkens and Toshindens of the era due to its flat, stiff animation. But even in 2D on console, the gorgeous 3DO port of Super Street Fighter 2 still put this dreary looking game firmly in its rearview mirror. I imagine that it's these visuals that immediately put a lot of people off. And things are just as unremarkable in the sound department. The music is very forgettable, aiming to be more cinematic than the catchy melodies of Street Fighter 2, and it really suffers for it. Voices too are muffled and scratchy even for this hardware, and even though they're more accurate than the arcade version, with Ryu in the Sega Saturn version and Ryu in the arcade,
Ryu versus Sega!
Ryu versus Vega!
it still doesn't sound that great. So the game looks bad, it sounds underwhelming, and it plays badly too, right? Actually,
Can I just shock you?
it doesn't. Unlike the mess that is the arcade game, Capcom took this title in-house to retool. The result? By putting the kibosh on Blade and the Bison Troopers, adding Blanca and DJ back into the lineup, and editing almost every frame of animation to more closely align to the characters in Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter the movie plays a lot like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Got a combo that works in Super Turbo? It will work here. Move properties, hitboxes, priorities and super moves, they're all pretty much exactly like they were in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. If you play through arcade mode, if you ignore the aesthetic, you can actually feel that the game plays like Super Turbo, albeit without the turbo option. It doesn't play like standard Super Street Fighter 2, character move lists and command normals are all from the latest Street Fighter 2 update of the time, but it plays at a pace more akin to the non-turbo version. There were several critics who mentioned slowdown and stiff gameplay. From my playing time over the years, I think that the slowdown moments were practically aligned to the original Street Fighter 2 and all of its Super Turbo follow-ups. Instances such as getting hit by a fireball, I think, are pretty much there by design. The stiffness, some of the special moves do feel like they're a bit stricter in terms of the inputs, but really, it's the animation that looks stiff rather than the game itself actually feeling stiff. Which means that this is just classic Street Fighter, albeit looking ugly, sounding unremarkable and missing a few characters. There are some other differences though. All characters now have access to super special moves. These differ to super combos and are very much precursors to the EX special moves that are in just about every Street Fighter game since Street Fighter 3 Second Impact. Basically, if you've got enough super meter, you can stick 2 punches or 2 kicks on the end of your special move command to give it a power up. It's not quite as slick as future EX moves would be in later Street Fighter games. For example, Ryu will actually fire 2 Hadoukens rather than fire a single fireball that hits twice. But it's an addition that doesn't actually feel out of place, and just as importantly, it doesn't unbalance the game. The second major differences involve boss characters. Akuma or Goki can now only be fought in trial mode, rather than the arcade mode as was the case in Super Turbo, but you can select him via a code, which is actually like Super Turbo in the arcade. And then Bison? Well, in arcade mode he's the same as before. However, in movie battle mode, you get to Bison and kick his ass, only for him to come back, kinda like the movie, and this version is brutal, with massively boosted health and attack power, as well as an unlimited super meter. He is a bastard. In capturing this footage, it took me over an hour to beat him. He's cheap and merciless and feels like Capcom doing their best to one-up SNK and Midway's cheap bosses. Well done lads, mission a bloody accomplished. So where does that leave Street Fighter the movie on Sega Saturn? At the time, it was absolutely savage critically for its visuals, for what many felt was dated gameplay, and for it being different to the arcade version. But playing it now, it just plays like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Why would you play this over Super Turbo? Well, you wouldn't. But bear in mind, this was the first Street Fighter game on Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. It tied to the recent movie and all of its assorted merchandising, and it featured digitized graphics, which were the style of the time. Street Fighter Alpha was several months away on console, and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo wouldn't appear on either the Saturn or the PlayStation until over 2 years later. So, as far as ways to play classic Street Fighter on the Sega Saturn were concerned, this was it. And with that in mind, it's easier to understand why Capcom released the game as it was. So how bad is Street Fighter the movie on Sega Saturn? Actually, it's not really that bad at all. It may look hideous, it may be missing characters, it may sound dull, but it plays well. You wouldn't choose it over any other version of Street Fighter 2, but when no other version existed on PlayStation or Saturn, really, it was fine. And I'd argue that it actually plays better than some other entries in the Street Fighter series. Street Fighter EX, I'm looking at you with your juggles, which ironically make you closer in terms of gameplay to the arcade movie game. Because at the end of the day, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is one of the greatest fighting games ever made. And an ugly port of a classic game is still a classic game, or at least an above average one. And it's certainly not terrible. But those are just my thoughts on this peculiar entry to the Street Fighter series, and we'd love to know what you think. So get in touch, and until next time, we will see you on the Sega side.
You win.